Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the dim, smoky world of a medieval forge. You can hear the hiss of steam as water meets hot iron, feel the dull ache in your shoulders from swinging a hammer that hasn't been light in years, and smell that strange blend of coal dust, singed leather, and old sweat that lingers no matter how often you wash. You might think it sounds rugged and noble, but if you were a blacksmith in the 14th century, you probably wouldn't survive this. Between inhaling soot, enduring burns, and grinding your joints into early ruin, the romance of forging was more about survival than artistry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a small timber-framed workshop somewhere in rural England around the year 1375. The door is low, you have to duck slightly, and the air is instantly heavier, warmer, and carries a fine grit that sticks in your throat. The blacksmith, a man in his late 40s who looks 20 years older, pauses mid-strike to glance at you. His beard is peppered with ash. His tunic, once brown, is almost black with a mixture of soot, grease and sweat. He doesn't greet you warmly. A customer isn't a guest after all. You're here to pay or barter, not to chat. The forge itself is a simple affair. A stone hearth lined with clay, filled with glowing coals fed by a hand-operated bellows. Every so often, he pulls a leather strap to draw in air, the embers flaring brighter, the sound almost like a beast breathing. Nearby there's a water trough, a worn wooden anvil stand, and a scattering of iron tongs, hammers, and the chisels that look as though they've been made and repaired by the same hand for decades. Life as a blacksmith wasn't glamorous, at least not the way you might picture from fantasy novels or modern craft fairs. For one thing, your working hours were long. The day began at first light and often went on until the sun was low, except during feast days or Sundays when the church demanded rest. But rest didn't mean idleness. You might still be sharpening tools for the parish or repairing hinges for the church door in exchange for nothing more than the vague promise of good standing in the community. Payment was inconsistent. In towns, some smiths worked on a cash basis, but in small villages, coin was rare. You might be paid in a bushel of barley, a wheel of cheese, or the right to graze your goat on someone else's pasture for a season. These barter arrangements kept you alive, but did little to help you get ahead. You didn't have the luxury of accumulating wealth. Even if you did, there were taxes, royal, manorial, and sometimes ecclesiastical, and the ever-present possibility that the local lord might request your labor for his own needs without much discussion about payment. Your diet, like most peasants, was heavy on bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables were in season. Meat was a rarity unless you hunted illegally in the Lord's forest, which carried the risk of a fine or worse. And for a man who burned as many calories as a blacksmith, this diet meant constant fatigue. Imagine hammering out horseshoes for half the village on little more than barley gruel and cabbage stew. The work itself was hazardous in ways that didn't make for heroic ballads. Burns were constant, hot metal splattered like fat from a frying pan. Your hands were perpetually blistered and calloused. Eye injuries were common from flying sparks or tiny shards of metal. Inhaling fine coal dust over years slowly destroyed your lungs, something people at the time called Smith's cough, long before anyone thought of the word pneumoconiosis. And then there were the injuries from lifting and swinging. Shoulders wore out, knees buckled, and backs became hunched before middle age. Still, the blacksmith was indispensable. You weren't just making swords or armor, in fact you rarely did. Most of your work was for farmers, carpenters, and the manor's stewards. Hinges, plowshares, hoes, nails, and iron fittings for carts. You mended broken chains, sharpened scythes, and occasionally worked on the banding for a barrel. A single day's work might touch almost every household in the village. That gave you a certain standing, but it was practical respect, not admiration. People needed you, but they didn't necessarily want to be you. Training for this life began young. Boys as young as 10 or 12 would apprentice, spending years on the dullest tasks, pumping the bellows, sweeping the floor, and fetching water, before they were trusted with actual forging. It wasn't just skill that took time to develop, it was endurance. Your body had to learn the rhythm of swinging a hammer all day without collapsing. And if you were unlucky, you might be apprenticed to a master who had little interest in teaching beyond what served his own needs. The medieval forge was not a solitary place, though. People came and went constantly. Farmers dropping off tools, neighbors passing news, children daring each other to stand too close to the fire. You became a hub of sorts, not because you wanted to be, but because the forge was where utility met necessity. And with that came the less glamorous side of human contact, gossip, arguments over payment, and the occasional drunken demand for urgent work on a Saturday night. One of the strange realities was that your role tied you to the pace of the agricultural year. Spring was a frenzy. Plowshares needed sharpening, hoes needed reforging, and every farmer was suddenly desperate for repairs. Summer brought steadier work, but also the heat of the forge combined with the heat of the season, which made the workshop almost unbearable. In autumn, the pace picked up again with harvest tools needing mending, and in winter, when the fields lay dormant, you still worked. But the cold made the iron more brittle and the coals more difficult to keep hot. You might think that at least the craft brought a certain personal pride, and it did, in moments. But that pride was tempered by the knowledge that your work wore out quickly. A plowshare you spent hours shaping could be dulled again in a week. A hinge could rust in a season, and no one would remember that you made it. The work was functional, ephemeral, and mostly anonymous. It's easy now to romanticize the idea of a medieval blacksmith, the lone craftsman in control of fire and iron. But the truth was more like a slow grind of necessity, where every day brought the same aches, the same soot, and the same barter exchanges for bread and barley. And yet, without men like this, without the repetitive, uncelebrated labor, entire villages would have faltered. The glamour may have been missing, but the quiet indispensability remained. And here's the curious thing. While blacksmiths were common enough to be almost invisible, certain ones became names whispered across regions, those who could shape iron more efficiently, or whose tools lasted longer. In a world without mass production, that kind of skill spread by word of mouth. Some even traveled for seasonal work, carrying their hammers and tongs from village to village, forging wherever there was need. But was this mobility an opportunity, or a burden? If you chose mobility, packing up your tools and traveling to other villages, your world expanded, but only in the narrow way that work dictates movement. You weren't sightseeing. You were walking along muddy, rutted tracks with a sack of iron scraps and a few tools slung over your shoulder, looking for a forge you could rent, or a barn corner you could convert into one. You would have to negotiate with the local manor for permission, and even then, you'd be under the watchful eye of the resident smith, if they had one, who might see you as competition. Traveling meant you were at the mercy of strangers' hospitality. You'd sleep in barns, sometimes in the forge itself, the lingering smell of yesterday's fire heavy in the air. Food was what could be spared, a ladle of pottage, a crust of bread. Some weeks were lean, others better. If you had a reputation for solid, quick work, farmers might line up before you'd even set the bellows pumping. The tools you carried were precious, not just because of their value, but because they were an extension of your skill. Hammers came in different weights for different jobs, lighter ones for finer shaping, heavier ones for brute force. Tongs had to grip everything from thin nails to thick horseshoes, and a good anvil, if you were lucky enough to work on one, was as important as the fire itself. Lose a hammer to theft or damage, and you could find yourself improvising with a poor substitute for months. Back home, stationary blacksmiths had other concerns. Your forge was an anchor point in the village economy, but that didn't mean stability. Metal had to be bought from somewhere. Iron ore wasn't something you casually dug up in the backyard. In England, Most small smiths purchased blooms from regional markets, where larger operations smelted ore into workable lumps. The price fluctuated depending on supply, harvest success, and political stability. If war disrupted trade routes, or if a lord decided to hoard metal for his own purposes, you might find yourself idle, not because you lacked skill, but because you had nothing to work with. And when you did have metal, you couldn't waste it. Every scrap from a broken tool was reworked into something else. Old nails reforged into smaller ones, broken horseshoes melted down for fittings, even bent hinges hammered straight and reused. Waste was expensive, both in terms of money and in the coal it took to heat the forge. You learned to think like a miser, every gram of iron accounted for. The coal was another story. In some regions, charcoal was more common, made by slowly burning wood in a covered mound until only carbon remained. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than raw wood, but it was labor-intensive to make and consumed a huge amount of timber. In more forested regions, smiths sometimes produced their own charcoal in off-hours, but in deforested areas, they had to buy it, again, at a price that could make or break the week's profit. The forge's fire was your lifeblood, but keeping it fed was an ongoing expense and worry. Work rhythms weren't dictated solely by demand. Weather played its part too. In summer, the air inside the forge became suffocating, the heat from the fire combining with the sun to create an almost oppressive blanket. You'd sweat through your tunic before midday, and your skin would be covered in a layer of grit that clung no matter how many times you wiped your face. In winter, the cold seeped into your bones, and keeping the fire hot enough to work iron was more difficult. Sometimes you'd stand so close to the flames that your front steamed while your back stayed cold. There was also the matter of repairs that couldn't wait. A broken plow in planting season was urgent. A farmer would stand at your elbow until it was fixed, knowing every lost day meant less food come harvest. Horseshoes for the Lord's mounts might take priority over every other job, whether you were paid for them or not. That meant long nights, working by the dim light of tallow candles or rush lamps, where the shadows on the wall seemed to grow longer than the hours. In some villages, the blacksmith also doubled as a farrier, responsible for shoeing horses and mules. This was a skill in itself, cutting and cleaning the hoof, shaping the shoe to fit, and nailing it in place without causing injury. A careless strike could lame an animal, a mistake that might cost you your reputation. Farriery was physically demanding in a different way, requiring you to work bent over or crouched for long periods, the animal's weight shifting against you. It was yet another source of aches that compounded over the years. The smith's social position was complicated. You weren't a peasant laborer in the fields, but you weren't a landowner either. You occupied a kind of middle ground, valued for your work, but always dependent on others for the resources to do it. In many places, you were tied to the local lord or manor, your freedom limited by customary obligations. Even if you technically owned your tools, you might be expected to work for the manor without payment during certain seasons or emergencies. Refusing wasn't a realistic option. Apprenticeships ensured that the craft passed on, but they also reinforced the slow churn of the blacksmith's life. Young apprentices became journeymen became masters, and the pattern repeated. Innovations came slowly, perhaps a new hammer shape, or a slightly more efficient bellows, but the essence of the work changed little over centuries, and it was a profession stuck in a functional time loop, where skill was honed but rarely revolutionized. One of the quiet realities was that many blacksmiths never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. The world outside the village might as well have been a rumor. The great cities with their sprawling markets and grand forges were as distant as the moon. For most, life was a cycle of fire, iron, and barter, until age or injury made swinging the hammer impossible. And when that day came, there was no pension, no savings. An aging smith might take on lighter tasks, repairing locks, making small fittings, but income would drop sharply. If you had family, they might support you. If not, You could find yourself reliant on the charity of neighbors or the church. It was a quiet, unremarkable end to a life of constant, essential labor. Yet, despite all of this, the burns, the debt, the exhaustion, some blacksmiths were genuinely proud of their craft. The rhythm of hammer on iron, the transformation of cold, unyielding metal into something useful, had its own quiet satisfaction. But one question lingers. In a life so bound by necessity, did that satisfaction outweigh the relentless grind? The slow grind of necessity shaped not only the blacksmith's daily life, but also the broader rhythm of the medieval village. Without the smith's labor, farming would halt, carpentry would slow, transport would falter, and even simple household maintenance would become a larger ordeal. Iron was the quiet backbone of the community, and the blacksmith was its reluctant steward. Still, it's worth understanding just how little the craft itself evolved for centuries. The basic toolkit, a hammer, an anvil, tongs, a bellows-fed fire, would be instantly recognizable to a smith working in the 12th century, or even the 16th. This continuity meant that the work was familiar, but also stagnant. Unlike the farmer who saw different crops each season, or the merchant who encountered new goods through trade, the blacksmith handled the same shapes, the same edges, the same fittings, year after year. In some ways, that monotony was a form of safety. A skilled blacksmith could expect consistent demand, even in times of famine or political unrest. But that security was fragile. Wars disrupted supply lines for iron and charcoal, forcing smiths to recycle old metal to the point of exhaustion. Plagues could empty villages, leaving no one to order tools or pay for repairs. And in times of heavy taxation, both lords and the crown might requisition metal for military purposes, stripping the village of resources for months or years. Records from manorial rolls in 14th century England show that smiths were sometimes exempted from certain agricultural duties because their work was considered too essential to interrupt. But this privilege came with obligations, repairing weapons for the local militia or working without pay for the manor in busy seasons. There are also accounts of smiths being required to produce nails for castle repairs without compensation, under threat of losing their place in village hierarchy. This dependence on the lord's favor meant the blacksmith's autonomy was always limited. A poor harvest could push the whole community into barter scarcity, and the smith might be one of the first to feel the pinch, as fewer people brought in work or offered enough in trade to keep the forge going. In lean times, a smith might find himself making more repairs to old tools rather than creating new ones, a slower, less profitable process that barely kept the fire lit. On the personal side, injury or illness was a near constant risk. Without modern medical knowledge, even a small burn could fester into a serious infection. Eye injuries could permanently impair vision. A bad back or crippled hand could end a career overnight. There were no safety nets. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Some smiths trained their eldest sons early, not just as apprentices, but as immediate replacements in case of such misfortune. And then there was the strange social contradiction. While the blacksmith was essential, he was also subject to suspicion. In some communities, the ability to control fire and shape metal carried a faint whiff of the supernatural in the minds of the superstitious. Folklore occasionally linked smiths with sorcery or hidden power. Legends told of smiths who forged swords with magical properties, or who could mend broken metal beyond normal skill. These were mostly harmless tales, but in more fearful times, any deviation from the expected could draw unwanted attention. By the late Middle Ages, as towns grew and trade networks expanded, blacksmithing began to specialize. Some smiths became armorers, others farriers, others nailmakers or locksmiths. In urban centers, guilds emerged to regulate quality, pricing, and training, offering a more structured but also more controlled career path. For rural smiths, however, life changed little. They remained jacks of all iron trades, turning out whatever the village needed and surviving on the same combination of barter, coin, and obligation. The irony of the medieval blacksmith's life is that it was both central and peripheral. central to the survival of the community, peripheral to its recognition and wealth. The work kept the village functioning, but rarely brought prosperity to the man at the anvil. When we picture a medieval smith today, it's often in the glow of cinematic forges or romanticized paintings. But the truth was a dim workshop, the ceaseless ringing of iron, the ache in your shoulders that never went away, and the knowledge that tomorrow would look much like today. And yet, without that ceaseless, unremarkable labor, the medieval world could not have turned. The blacksmith's work didn't just support the village economy, it literally held it together, one nail, one hinge, one plowshare at a time. So the question lingers. Was the quiet indispensability of the blacksmith's role enough to make the hardship worthwhile? Or was it simply another life lived in service to the unending demands of survival? After the steady clang of the forge and the scent of coal smoke, we move to a very different kind of labor. The air grows cooler, quieter. Instead of hammers and tongs, there is the faint scratch of quill on parchment, the slow rhythm of ink drying, and the unbroken stillness of stone walls. The blacksmith's life was measured in blows of the hammer. The scribe's life was measured in lines of text. Story 2. The endless accounting of a monastery scribe. Imagine waking in the pre-dawn chill of a 13th century monastery. The stone beneath your feet is cold, even through woolen socks. You rise from a narrow bed in the dormitory, the air heavy with the faint scent of tallow from last night's candles, and file silently with the other monks toward the chapel for matins. There is no hurry. There never is. But there is never any real pause, either. Your day has already been planned for you, as it has been every day for years. The scriptorium, where you will spend most of your waking hours, is not the romanticized library you might imagine. It is a long, narrow room, sometimes heated but often not, lined with desks set against windows that are deliberately small to keep out the cold and limit glare. Each desk has a slanted writing surface, a knife for trimming quills, a small dish for ink, and whatever text you are currently copying. The room smells faintly of vellum, animal skin prepared into parchment, which has its own dry, almost dusty odor. Your work begins with preparation. Vellum sheets arrive from the monastery's parchmenter, each one scraped, stretched, and cut to size. You run your fingers lightly across the surface, checking for uneven patches or tiny holes. If the parchment is too thick or too thin, the ink might bleed, and the page will be ruined. Nothing is wasted here. A damaged sheet might be trimmed down for smaller documents, but for the book you are working on, a copy of the monastery's account rolls, each page must be pristine. The accounts themselves are not thrilling to read, nor are they meant to be. They are lists of rents paid, tithes collected, expenses for grain, repairs to the cloister roof, payments for candles, and wages for hired labor. Your job is to copy them with exactness, line by line, column by column. A single transposed digit or misspelled name could throw the records into confusion, and while this might seem trivial, in a world without duplicate ledgers or printed forms, it could mean the loss of property or revenue for the monastery. Quill in hand, you dip into the ink, a deep black made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, and begin to write. The quill glides with surprising smoothness when freshly trimmed, but the tip wears quickly on parchment, requiring frequent resharpening with your small penknife. The work is slow and deliberate. Every letter is formed in the prescribed style of the house, whether a rounded Carolingian script or the tighter, angular Gothic hand that has become common in your time. There is no room for artistic flair here. This is accounting, not illumination. Hours pass like this. Outside the scriptorium, other monks are tending gardens, baking bread, or singing in the choir. Inside, the only sound is the faint scratch and occasional creak of wooden stools. The light from the narrow windows shifts as the morning passes, and you adjust your position to keep the page evenly lit. In winter, the cold seeps into your fingers, making them stiff. In summer, flies sometimes land on the wet ink, leaving tiny blemishes that must be scraped away with the knife. Mid-morning, the bell rings for terce, and you set down your work. Prayer punctuates the day, dividing it into distinct segments, but it also breaks the flow of copying. Returning to the desk afterward, you must find your play. See again, carefully aligning the lines on the page with the master copy. There is no skipping ahead, no summarizing. The record must match exactly. The accounts themselves tell their own story, though most people never read them as such. You see the ebb and flow of the monastery's fortunes, years when rents are plentiful, years when repairs dominate expenses, years when plague or famine leave glaring gaps in tenant payments. Names of local farmers and craftsmen pass under your pen, some appearing for decades, others disappearing suddenly, never to return. You do not ask what became of them. That is not your task. By midday, you have completed perhaps a page and a half. This is not due to laziness, but to the demands of accuracy. A single folio in an account book might represent weeks of work, especially if tables of figures require precise alignment. There are no erasers. Mistakes are corrected by scraping away the top layer of parchment and rewriting, but too much correction can damage the page entirely. After the midday meal in the refectory, a thin vegetable pottage and a hunk of bread, you return to the scriptorium. The light now falls differently, and shadows creep into the corners. You shift the page and your stool accordingly, but in the dim months of winter, the workday shortens. Without good light, accuracy suffers. Candlelight is used sparingly, not because it cannot illuminate the page, but because the smoke discolors parchment and the cost of candles is high. As you write, your eyes begin to tire. The black of the ink seems to blur into the off-white of the parchment, and the fine lines between columns require effort to focus on. There is no talk in the scriptorium. Conversation is for the cloister walk, not the workroom. So the fatigue is battled in silence. Sometimes a fellow scribe lets out an unintentional sigh, and the sound feels almost startling in the stillness. Late in the day, you complete the last column you had planned, sand the wet ink lightly to prevent smudging, and set the folio aside. Tomorrow, you will return to the same ledger, the same slow march of figures and rents, until it is done. And when it is done, another book will take its place. The work is endless, and that is the point. The question that sometimes drifts across your mind, though you never speak it aloud, is whether the endless copying of these accounts changes anything for you, or whether it simply binds you more tightly to the unbroken, silent rhythm of the monastery's life. When the monastery bell rings for vigils or lauds, you feel the same slow pull you always do, half your mind still on the page you left in the scriptorium. The work never truly leaves you. It lingers in the way you notice the shape of letters on chapel inscriptions, the way your hands unconsciously measure spacing on the rim of your bowl at supper. The accounts you copy are more than mere lists. They are the fabric of the monastery's connection to the world beyond its walls. Every payment recorded, every tally of grain owed, is a thread binding the cloister to the village and countryside. The monastery might appear self-contained, but its survival depends on those rents and tithes, and your ink ensures they cannot be forgotten or denied. Accuracy is not only a virtue here, it is protection. A clear, precise account is proof against disputes. If a tenant claims he paid his rent last year, the ledger will prove or disprove it. If the bailiff says a certain number of bushels came in from a distant grange, your record is the monastery's defense. The abbot may never speak of it directly, but your quiet labor is a shield, one that guards the house's lands and income. This responsibility shapes your working habits. You begin each new page by checking the master document against the last entry you completed, ensuring no line has been skipped. You rule your columns lightly with a lead point, guidelines invisible to the casual reader, but essential for keeping figures straight. The knife at your side is not only for quill sharpening, it scrapes away errors with careful, deliberate strokes, leaving the surface just smooth enough to take ink again. Too rough, and the letter will blur. Your tools require their own maintenance. Quills wear quickly, and a scribe's hand must be ready to recut them at a moment's notice. The ink, kept in a horn or ceramic pot, thickens if left too low. And you stir it with a splinter of wood to restore its flow. Even the desk must be kept clean. Crumbs of parchment dust can catch the quill and cause an unwanted blot. It is quiet work, but not passive. The scriptorium itself is a study in repetition. The same chairs, the same angled desks, the same narrow windows letting in a measured slice of light. You come to know exactly how far the sun will move before the bell rings for the next prayer, exactly how many lines you can complete before the shadows shift. This constancy can be a comfort, but it can also weigh heavily. Each day, an almost perfect reflection of the last. Occasionally, the accounts bring news of the world's disruptions. A sudden spike in grain prices appears in the figures. A war in a distant shire has cut off trade, forcing the monastery to pay more for flour. Or a line of entries for tenant payments is interrupted by a note in the margin: deceased, land fallow, or dwelling empty. You don't see the events themselves, only their financial echo. The physical toll is subtle but insistent. Long hours hunched over the desk strain your back and shoulders. Your eyes work constantly to focus on the fine lines of script, and in dim light, you sometimes see a faint halo around the letters. Your fingers cramp from holding the quill too tightly, and though you shift your grip to relieve it, the ache never truly fades. There is no concept of ergonomics here. You adjust to the work, not the other way around. Meals are a brief relief, but they are eaten in silence, with a reader reciting from the rule or from scripture. Even leisure is bounded by the monastery's rhythm. If you walk in the cloister after supper, you pass the same arches, the same gravel paths, the same low beds of herbs that the infirmary will use for remedies. Life is contained, and your place in it is certain. The monotony is broken only when a particularly large or important book arrives in the scriptorium, a cartulary of the monastery's charters, for example, or a new copy of the Gospels. But even then you are rarely assigned to the decorative work. That belongs to the illuminators, whose task it is to add color and ornament. Your work is in the plain text, the columns and tables, the precise rendering of figures and dates. And so, day after day, you measure your progress not in pages finished, but in pages done correctly. A ledger without errors is its own kind of accomplishment, though it may never be praised. There is no ceremony when a year's accounts are complete. The book is simply bound and placed in the archive, its pages closing on the hours you have given it. Every so often you wonder, though only privately, if anyone will ever read these records again, or if they will sit in the cool dark for centuries, their ink slowly fading, their meaning lost to anyone who does not care about bushels of rye or the rent for a strip of meadowland. But then the bell rings for the next prayer, and you return to your desk, ready to set down the next column of figures. It's in these moments between thought and ink that you might quietly ask yourself, is the act of recording history in such minute detail a way of preserving the world, or merely a way of proving to ourselves that it existed at all? The final shape of your work is rarely dramatic. A completed ledger is bound between simple wooden boards, covered in plain leather, and stacked alongside others on a narrow shelf in the archive room. The volumes stand in silence, their spines marked only with a year or brief description. Rents and accounts, 1274, 1276. Grain tallies, years of famine. To anyone glancing at them, they are uniform and unremarkable. To you, they are months, sometimes years, of your life rendered in ink. The archive itself is cool and dry, deliberately so. The thick stone walls and small windows protect the parchment from dampness and light. You place the ledger carefully, knowing that it might not be touched again for decades, perhaps centuries. And yet, in that act of storing it away, your work vanishes into the quiet. No one praises a ledger for its penmanship. No feast is held to celebrate a completed year of accounting. The scribe's labor is deliberately invisible. Its success is measured by absence. Absence of disputes, absence of missing rents, absence of costly mistakes. When the abbot or cellarer speaks of the monastery's good order, it is the ledgers that underpin his confidence, though your name is rarely mentioned. This anonymity is part of the monastic way. Pride is discouraged, and personal recognition is seen as a distraction from the work's purpose. Still, it is human to wonder, as you watch the daylight fade across the scriptorium wall, whether your care and precision will matter to anyone beyond the present moment. Will a scribe centuries from now trace these same lines with a finger and think of the hand that wrote them? Or will the page be seen only as a vessel for its information, the life that created it left entirely unconsidered? Outside the cloister, the world shifts in ways you hear about only in fragments. A lord's son goes to war. A market burns in a distant tea town. A king dies. But inside, the rhythm of writing remains unchanged. The blacksmith's forge might flare and dim with the needs of the season, but your work flows as evenly as the lines you rule. In the monastery's calendar, there is no off-season for memory. Even illness or injury is no certain reprieve. If your eyes fail, you may be set to dictating as others write. If your hands weaken, you might be tasked with reviewing or checking completed work. The accounting never stops. It simply shifts to whoever can hold the quill. The ledger must be maintained, for without it, the monastery's place in the world becomes harder to defend. And yet, in the quiet of the scriptorium, there is a kind of peace that other labors cannot offer. No soot blackens your hands, no animals kick against your hold, no fieldwork bends your back under the sun. Your burdens are different, the ache in your neck, the slow wear on your eyes, the mental strain of unbroken attention. But they are steady, predictable, and in that predictability lies a strange form of security. The work of the monastery scribe is not celebrated in songs or remembered in legends. It is the work of preserving order, of maintaining the threads that bind the monastery to its lands and people. The ledgers you complete are not stories, but they are the framework in which stories happen. Perhaps that is the scribe's quiet truth. To labor every day knowing that the best outcome is for your work to be taken for granted. It is not a glorious role, but it is essential, one of those invisible foundations without which the medieval world would falter. And so the question lingers. Is it enough to know that your life's work supports the greater whole, even if no one remembers the hand that held the quill? Leaving the cool stillness of the scriptorium, we step out into the open air, into a world where work is measured not in lines of ink, but in shovelfuls of earth. The quiet scratch of a quill gives way to the dull thud of spades in soil, the creak of wooden wheelbarrows, and the slow, endless sound of water seeping into the ground. Where the scribe's work is neat and dry, the moat digger's life is mud, sweat, and patience. Story 3. How to spend your entire life. Digging a moat. Picture a construction site in the late 12th century. Not the kind with cranes and steel beams, but a wide, uneven trench surrounding the rising walls of a new stone castle. The smell is of wet earth and standing water. The air is filled with the clatter of tools and the occasional shouted instruction from a foreman. Men bend their backs over long-handled shovels, prying up clods of clay and heaving them into waiting carts. The sound is steady but unhurried, the rhythm of labor that has no real end in sight. You are one of these workers. Your task is deceptively simple. Dig. The moat will be wide enough to keep siege engines at a distance and deep enough to hold water year-round. It will take years, maybe decades, to complete. For now, all you can see is a raw channel of earth, slowly taking shape under countless hands. The work is brutally physical. You start at dawn, when the ground is cool and damp, the mist still hanging over the low areas. Your spade is made of wood with an iron edge, heavy enough to bite into the soil, but awkward to lift when loaded. You plant your foot on the back of the blade, push down hard, and pry up a slice of earth. If the soil is dry, it crumbles easily. If it's wet, it clings to the spade and has to be shaken off. The spoil, what you've dug out, must go somewhere. Sometimes it's piled along the inner edge of the moat, forming an embankment. Sometimes it's carted, a way to level other parts of the castle grounds. In either case, it's one more lift, one more heave, one more burden for your already aching shoulders. The days blur together. Dig, lift, haul, tip, return. In wet weather, the trench becomes a pit of sticky mud, clinging to your boots and making every step a struggle. In dry spells, the earth bakes hard, forcing you to swing a pick before you can dig at all. Neither condition makes the job easier, only different. Pay is meager, if it comes in coin at all. Many moat diggers are peasants performing corvée labour, days or weeks of unpaid work owed to the lord as part of their tenancy. Others are hired labourers, paid by the day, their wages barely covering food and drink. For the poorest, the promise of bread, ale, and a place to sleep is payment enough, though the shelter is often just a spot in a barn or under a crude lean-to near the worksite. Food is simple: coarse bread, pottage of peas or beans, and occasionally some salt pork or herring if supplies are good. You eat quickly, seated on the ground or on an overturned cart, the sun already high and the foreman eager to see you back at work. The meal is less a break than a pause, your hands still streaked with soil as you tear at the bread. The moat's size means that the project moves in sections. One part may be in its first stages, with grass and topsoil still being removed. Another may be much deeper, where water has already begun to seep in. Workers are shifted between these areas as needed, but the trench's sheer scale makes it feel like a living thing, slow to grow, slow to change, indifferent to the people shaping it. Tools wear out quickly. Spade edges dull, pick handles splinter, carts lose their wheels. The castle's blacksmith spends much of his time repairing or replacing them, his work feeding directly into yours. And when a tool breaks midday, you simply switch to another task, hauling spoil, clearing debris, or carrying timber for the retaining walls until it's fixed. The moat's purpose is clear enough: to slow attackers, to protect the castle walls, to give defenders more time to repel a siege. But for you, it is less a military feature than an endless hole in the ground. You will never see it finished in the sense of being tested in battle. If you stay here long enough, you will only see it lined with stone and filled with water, your own labour hidden beneath its surface. And yet, even this slow work has its hazards. The sides of the trench can collapse unexpectedly, especially after heavy rain, burying anyone caught below. Waterlogged soil can give way underfoot, sucking at your boots and pulling you down. In summer, the heat reflecting off the exposed clay can be stifling. In winter, the frozen ground can tear the skin from your knuckles. There are no safety measures beyond caution and experience. You know, though you rarely speak of it, that the moat will likely outlast you. Your share of the digging will be indistinguishable from anyone else's. The walls it defends will bear the names of lords and masons, not labourers. But your work is part of that invisible foundation that makes the visible structure possible. Still, as you lean on your spade at the end of another long day, the trench stretching on in both directions, you can't help but wonder, is the moat a monument to defence, or simply a monument to the countless days of human effort swallowed by its banks? The moat, like any great work of earth and stone, is not simply dug once and left alone. Progress is slow, and so is the planning. The master of works, an older man with a long memory for measurements, walks the trench every few days, noting where the slope is too steep, where the clay is too soft, where more timber will be needed to shore up the walls. He speaks in numbers and spans, the language of geometry brought to muddy reality by your labour. From his plans, the moat is not just a ditch, it is a carefully engineered barrier. The outer slope must be shallow enough to resist collapse, but steep enough to make climbing difficult. The base must be level, to allow water to pool evenly. In certain sections, stone facing will be laid to prevent erosion. each block hauled and placed by masons working in parallel to the diggers. Your part in this process rarely changes. The work is divided into teams: diggers, haulers, stone carriers, timber cutters. Most days you remain with the diggers. Your task is clear: cut the trench deeper, keep the spoil moving, keep the slope stable. The monotony is its own kind of discipline. You stop thinking in terms of weeks or months, and instead measure progress by the number of cartloads you've shifted since dawn. The castle's water supply complicates things. In some moats, water is diverted from a nearby river or spring. In others, the plan is to let rainwater fill the space over time. Either way, you must contend with the ground's natural seepage. In wetter areas, you dig in ankle-deep mud, every spadeful heavier than the last. In drier spots, the earth is so compacted that your spade rings like a bell when it hits a stone. The foreman's orders can seem arbitrary. One day deepening a section, the next widening another, then suddenly stopping work on a stretch entirely. These pauses often come from disputes higher up. The lord may want to adjust the moat's shape to include an outer barbican, or the masons may need time to build a bridge foundation before you continue. You do not question these decisions. The work simply shifts, as it always does. Paydays, if you are one of the few receiving coin, are irregular. Sometimes you wait weeks for the steward to appear with his pouch, doling out small silver pennies into calloused hands. Others receive payment in kind: grain, cloth, or even exemption from certain dues. For corvée labourers, there is no payment beyond the fulfilment of obligation. The absence of a fine, or the goodwill of the lord, is reward enough to avoid trouble. Breaks in the labour come only with the weather. Heavy snow can halt digging entirely, forcing you into other work, repairing palisades, clearing paths, or even serving in the kitchens. But the moat is never far from mind, and the first thaw brings you back to it, the ground slick and treacherous underfoot. The social life of the moat digger is bound to the trench. You know the men beside you by the sound of their shovels and the rhythm of their breathing. You learn who works steadily and who needs watching, who can haul a full cart without spilling and who can't be trusted near the slope. Jokes are sparse, conversation practical. Long days leave little energy for talk, and the noise of work swallows most words before they carry far. Sometimes, travelling merchants pass by on the road beyond the construction site, bringing news from the wider world. A war in the north, a new tax in the south, a plague of locusts in the next shire. These reports feel distant, almost unreal, compared to the immediate reality of the trench. Your life is measured in feet of earth, not in the affairs of kings. By year's end, the moat has grown in ways that are difficult to see unless you step back. The outer wall of the castle rises higher, the inner ember. Encampment is more defined. The water begins to gather in low spots, but the trench is still incomplete, the gaps still wide. The project is not a season's work. It is a lifetime's, and so you keep digging, knowing that when this section is done, there will be another and another after that. The moat is less a task to be finished than a landscape to be shaped, one that changes slowly under the persistence of human effort. Still, as you wipe the sweat from your brow and look down into the trench, you can't help but wonder, when the water finally fills this space, will anyone remember the names of those who carved it from the earth? Years pass. The trench deepens, widens, and takes on a more finished shape. The castle above it grows taller, its stone walls now complete in places where once only timber and scaffolding stood. To the untrained eye, the moat looks much the same as it did seasons ago, but you know every curve, every slope, every stretch of wall. You've dug through layers of earth that have not seen daylight since before your grandfather was born. The process of finishing a moat is as deliberate as its excavation. Stone masons line the inner walls with carefully fitted blocks, their work slower but more precise than yours. Carpenters construct sluice gates to control the flow of water from nearby streams. The smell of fresh-cut timber mixes with the damp, mineral scent of the trench. When the sluice is first opened, the transformation is gradual. A thin trickle at first, then a steady pour, then the slow rising of water along the base. You work on the banks now, driving in stakes to support the soil until the water's presence does the work for you. Some days, the water level drops unexpectedly, lost through unseen channels in the earth, and you find yourself digging again, sealing leaks with clay. The first time you see the moat full, it is almost disorienting. Where there was once open space, there is now a broad, still expanse of water, mirroring the castle walls. It is beautiful in a way that is difficult to admit, because beauty is not what you were hired for. And yet, you know this view exists because of years of anonymous labor, yours and that of dozens of others whose names no one recorded. In peacetime, the moat's role is more practical than heroic. It serves as a barrier against thieves, a fishery for carp and eels, and a convenient dumping place for waste the Lord does not want on castle grounds. It needs constant maintenance, dredging silt, reinforcing banks, repairing sluice, is damaged by frost. These tasks are less backbreaking than the original digging, but they keep you tied to the moat long after its completion. You see the seasons turn in its surface, frost in winter, pollen in spring, dragonflies in summer, drifting leaves in autumn. The water is never still in truth. It shifts with the wind, the rain, the slow breathing of the land itself. When word comes of a distant war, the moat suddenly gains new importance. The castle is provisioned, the drawbridge repaired, the guards more alert. You find yourself looking at the water differently now, not as an obstacle you helped create, but as a line between safety and danger. In the end, the danger never comes. The army marches elsewhere. The Lord's enemies vanish into treaties or exhaustion. The moat remains, undisturbed except for the ripple of a fish breaking the surface. You grow older, your back stiff from decades of lifting and bending. New hands take up the shovels for repairs. New foremen shout the same instructions you once followed without question. The moat no longer feels like your project. It belongs to the castle, to time itself. You realize that the moat's true purpose was never just to keep enemies out. It was to stand as a statement of permanence. A lord's banner may change, his heirs may quarrel, but the moat will still encircle the stone walls as a quiet, unyielding boundary. And perhaps that is the final truth. The moat is not a monument to victory or conquest, but to patience. It is a human scar upon the earth, one dug not in haste, but in slow, deliberate persistence. The water laps gently at the stone, and you wonder, if 100 years from now someone stands here and looks out across it, will they think about the years of work it took to bring it into being? Or will they simply see a strip of water and move on, unaware of the lives that shaped it? The moat remains behind you now, still and timeless, but our path winds further into the daily machinery of medieval life. Not the battles, not the kings, but the unremarkable, quietly essential tasks without which none of the grander things could function. For our final story tonight, we step into the dim, dusty spaces where parchment and patience meet, into the life of the medieval scribe. Story 4. A lifetime of letters. The work of the medieval scribe. The scriptorium is cold in the mornings, even in summer. Stone walls hold the night's chill, and the only light comes from narrow windows set high in the wall. You arrive before the bell for prime, when the other monks are still at their morning prayers, because the day's work begins with preparation, not writing. You start by trimming quills, goose feathers mostly, though swan or crow will do in a pinch. The knife, your penknife, is sharp, and the shaping of a nib is both a craft and a quiet test of your patience. Cut too deeply, and the quill splits. Too shallow, and the ink will blot the page. Each quill lasts only so long. A scribe's day might see 3 or 4 worn down to stubs. Ink is kept in small horn pots, covered to keep out dust and flies. It is made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, boiled and strained until smooth. The smell is sharp, metallic. You stir it with a narrow stick before each session, because even good ink settles if left too long. The parchment, vellum for finer works, is scraped smooth by the parchmenter before it reaches your desk. Even so, each sheet must be inspected. Tiny flaws in the skin can cause the pen to skip or tear. You rub a pumice stone over the surface, dust it with chalk to take the ink better, and stack the prepared sheets neatly to your left. Once the abbot approves the day's assigned work, perhaps a psalter for the choir, a copy of a theological commentary, or a charter for a local lord, you settle at your desk. The furniture is simple but functional: a slanted board to hold the page at a comfortable angle, a low stool, and a shelf for tools. You brace your left arm against the edge to steady yourself. Copying is not a mindless act. Each letter must be formed according to the script in use. Caroline minuscule in one house, Gothic textura in another. Its shape dictated by tradition as much as by legibility. The model text is kept before you, sometimes on a stand, sometimes in a separate quire beside your elbow. Your eyes shift constantly between source and copy, each glance a measure against error. The work is slow. A good scribe might copy 2 or 3 pages in a long day, more if the text is plain, less if it contains elaborate initials or marginal decoration. Illuminators sometimes work alongside you, or more often after you, adding gold leaf and colored pigments to spaces you've carefully left blank. Mistakes happen. When they do, there are remedies: a fine knife to scrape the ink from the parchment, a damp cloth to soften the fibers, a careful rewrite over the repaired space. But too many corrections mark a scribe as careless, and reputation matters even in a monastery. Some errors, especially in sacred texts, must be noted in the margin, not hidden, for fear of altering meaning. Meals break the day into halves. At midday, you lay down the quill and file out with the others to the refectory. Conversation is forbidden, but your hands rest, your back loosens, and you eat in silence while a reader recites from a religious text. Afterward, you return to the scriptorium, where the air feels warmer now and the light is better. The afternoon passes in the same rhythm: dip, stroke, glance, repeat. The sound is a soft scratch, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of parchment or the snap of a quill's tip. By the time the bell for Vespers rings, your fingers are stained, your neck stiff, and your eyes slightly unfocused. You cover the ink pots, stack the work under a linen cloth to protect it, and step out into the evening air. And so the days repeat. The manuscript grows by slow degrees, gathering meaning in the spaces between effort and time. But as you leave the scriptorium one evening, you notice a stack of completed books bound in leather and lined on a shelf. You recognize your own handwriting among them, and wonder, in the quiet of your cell later that night, will anyone ever know which words were traced by your hand? The seasons pass, and the work continues much as before. Summer light lingers longer in the scriptorium, easing the strain on your eyes. In winter, the hours of work are cut by necessity. No candlelight is allowed near precious parchment, and oil lamps smoke too much for the abbot's liking. The cold in those months seeps into your joints, and the ink thickens in its pot, requiring more stirring to stay fluid. Your role as a scribe is more than simple copying. Occasionally you are asked to act as a corrector, comparing the work of other scribes against the exemplar text, marking flaws, and deciding whether a page must be redone entirely. This requires a different kind of attention, one that moves more slowly, reading not just for letters, but for meaning. The library is both your resource and your reminder of the scale of your labor. Its shelves are not many, perhaps 100 volumes in total, but each represents months, sometimes years of human effort. Some were copied here, others were gifts from distant monasteries or wealthy patrons. Each is chained to the desk on which it rests, to prevent theft. The chain rattles softly when a book is opened, a sound as familiar to you as the rustle of turning pages. Outside the cloister walls, literacy is rare. The local townsfolk may know their letters well enough to sign a mark, but reading whole sentences is a skill reserved for the clergy, a handful of merchants, and noble households. This makes your work valuable, though not in the way physical labor is valued. A farmer brings in grain, a smith shapes iron. Your product is measured in quiet, enduring pages. There are days when the work feels painfully repetitive. Psalms you have copied before appear again, the same verses passing under your hand for the third or fourth time in your life. Your mind drifts, and the danger is real. Wandering thoughts lead to wandering lines, and an error that must be scraped away. But there are also days when the work feels oddly expansive. You find yourself handling texts from far places, copies of Roman authors, treatises from scholars you have never met, even a translation from the Arabic of a medical work that describes plants and treatments unknown to your monastery's gardens. You trace their letters carefully, half understanding their meaning, but aware that you are a link in a long chain of preservation. The margins of your work sometimes bear small notes, not from you, but from others who will read these pages decades later. A scribe who comes after may leave a comment about the weather or about the difficulty of the text. One, in a manuscript you are tasked with repairing, has written, "As the snow falls, I long for spring." Such personal touches remind you that this trade, for all its rules and repetition, is done by living hands, in changing seasons, under skies that are never the same twice. The tools of your work wear down with you. Quills must be replaced, the pumice stones grow smoother, the blades of your penknife dull with each sharpening. Even the desk's surface bears faint grooves where your wrists have rested, a record of hours spent hunched over the page. By now, you have trained younger scribes. You show them how to cut a nib at the right angle, how to hold the quill so the ink flows without blotting, how to measure margins with a piece of twine knotted at exact lengths. You see your own early errors in their work, the hesitations, the uneven spacing, the occasional smudge. Correcting them requires patience, but also the memory of your own mistakes. And yet, for all this careful instruction, you know that most readers of these books will never think of the people who made them. The letters will be read for their meaning, not their form. The margins will be turned without a glance. As the bells toll, Compline and you put away your tools, you find yourself wondering, in 100 years, when your books are old and their bindings worn, will anyone still care enough to copy them again? Or will the words stop here, their meaning fading into silence? Years in the scriptorium have left their marks. Your eyesight, once sharp enough to catch the faintest misstroke, now blurs if you work too long without pause. The stiffness in your back is a constant companion, a reminder of the hours bent over a narrow desk. Yet the rhythm of the work is so deeply ingrained that even on feast days, when the scriptorium is closed, you sometimes feel restless without the weight of a quill in your hand. By this time you have produced dozens of manuscripts. Some are modest, unadorned service books for the monastery's daily prayers. Others are ornate gifts, bound in leather with gilt clasps, commissioned by noble patrons in exchange for grain, wool, or coin. You remember the long hours those volumes required, the careful spacing of illuminated capitals, the nervous application of gold leaf that can flake away if handled too roughly. The binding process, though not your primary task, has grown familiar over the years. Finished pages are gathered into quires, groups of folded sheets, then sewn together with linen thread. Wooden boards serve as covers, overlaid with leather or cloth. You have seen binders press the volumes under heavy weights, shaping them into the rectangular solidity that will let them rest evenly on a shelf. A book, when finished, feels like something meant to last. Occasionally, one of your older works returns to the scriptorium for repair. The parchment may have been nibbled by mice, or damp may have spotted the pages. You hold it in your hands, and recognize the curve of your own handwriting from decades earlier. The ink has browned slightly with age, but the letters are still crisp. You think of the hours that went into each page, and how those hours now lie folded into time itself. Beyond the cloister, the world is shifting in ways you can only partly sense. Merchants from the cities bring news of new techniques, cheaper than parchment, arriving from distant lands. Presses that can produce many pages quickly, though you have yet to see such a device. Younger scribes speak of them with uncertainty, as though the very nature of the work might be changing. But within these walls, life is steady. The bells still divide the day, the quills still wear down to stubs, and the books continue to grow in number. You know the scriptorium will outlast you. Another hand will take your place at the desk, sharpening quills in the morning light, dipping into the same ink pots, tracing letters in a practiced, almost meditative way. In the quiet moments between tasks, you sometimes imagine the journey of your work. A psalter carried to a distant priory, its pages turned by candlelight. A charter stored in a nobleman's chest, consulted only in times of dispute. A medical text opened by a physician who will never know the name of the man who copied it. Your life's labor is scattered in silent fragments, embedded in the daily workings of others' lives. One evening, as you leave the scriptorium for the last time, you pause in the doorway. The light from the high windows falls across the desks, catching dust in the air like motes of gold. The smell of ink and parchment hangs faintly, familiar as your own breath. You know that tomorrow, and the day after, and many days after that, the room will look much the same. And you realize, your place in history is not to be remembered, but to have helped others remember. The words you copied will outlive you, their meaning carried forward, even if your hand is forgotten. Still, a quiet question lingers. When the last of these books is worn beyond repair, will anyone care to copy the words again? Or will they be left to fade into the silence you have spent a lifetime resisting?